At some point after awakening, many people notice something deeply confusing and unsettling. The things they once wanted so badly, success, recognition, ambition, possessions, even certain relationships, no longer carry the same pull. It's not that these things are suddenly wrong or unavailable. They are still there, still possible. But the hunger for them has quietly faded. And when this happens, the mind panics. It asks, what's wrong with me? Why don't I want anything anymore? According to Alan Watts, this is one of the most misunderstood stages of awakening, because desire is not just something we have. It is something we use to define who we are. Alan Watts often explained that desire gives the ego its sense of direction. Wanting something creates a future, and that future gives the self a reason to exist. I am the one who is becoming this, the ego says. But when awakening deepens, this future-oriented movement begins to dissolve. The self that was always reaching forward starts to relax. And when it relaxes, desire weakens. Not because you failed or become apathetic, but because the mechanism that generated constant wanting is losing its grip. This is why the end of desire feels frightening. Desire was never just about pleasure or reward. It was about meaning. It gave structure to your life. It gave you a reason to wake up, to strive, to improve, to move forward. When that structure dissolves, life can feel strangely open, almost too open. According to Alan Watts, the ego experiences this openness as danger because it no longer knows how to orient itself without something to chase. You may notice that old dreams feel artificial, as if they belong to someone else. Goals that once felt essential now seem optional or even irrelevant. And the mind reacts by trying to reignite the old hunger. It tells you that without desire, you will stagnate, that you will become lazy, that life will lose its color. But Alan Watts would say that this fear misunderstands what desire really is. Desire is not the source of life's energy. It is a symptom of inner tension, the feeling that something is missing and must be acquired. When awakening loosens that tension, the sense of lack fades. And when lack fades, desire naturally fades with it. But because we have been conditioned to believe that wanting is what keeps us alive, the absence of desire feels like something essential has been lost. In reality, what is ending is not vitality, but compulsion. The endless reaching that once drove your life is slowing down, revealing a different way of being that does not depend on chasing something in the future to feel complete. As this stage deepens, another subtle realization appears. The things you once wanted were never really about the things themselves. According to Alan Watts, desire is usually a symbol, not a literal need. We don't want money for paper, status for titles, or success for applause. We wanted what we believed those things would finally give us: safety, worth, belonging, or peace. Awakening begins to dissolve this confusion. You start seeing that the promised fulfillment was always postponed into the future, and the chase itself kept the feeling of lack alive. Alan Watts often described desire as a trick of time. The mind says, when I get there, then I will be whole. But there never arrives, because the moment it does, the mind creates a new destination. This endless movement forward gives the illusion of progress, but it also creates quiet exhaustion. When awakening loosens the mind's attachment to time, this illusion starts to break down. The future loses its hypnotic power. And without the future pulling you forward, desire weakens. This is why many people in awakening feel a strange emptiness, not because something is missing, but because something unnecessary has stopped running. The constant internal pressure to become more, achieve more, or prove something slowly fades. Yet because this pressure has been present for so long, its absence feels unfamiliar, even wrong. The mind labels it boredom, depression, or loss of motivation. But Alan Watts would say this is not a collapse into nothingness. It is a return to simplicity. You may notice yourself no longer impressed by things that once excited you. Achievements feel temporary. Accumulation feels heavy. Even praise can feel strangely hollow. This does not mean you are becoming indifferent to life. It means you are becoming sensitive to what is real. The mind is no longer easily seduced by symbols of fulfillment. It begins to sense that peace cannot be stored, earned, or displayed. According to Alan Watts, this is where many people panic and try to resurrect old desires. They force ambition, chase stimulation, or create artificial urgency just to feel alive again. But this only creates inner conflict because part of you now sees through the game. You can still participate in the world, still act, still create, but the unconscious hunger that once fueled everything has changed. This stage is not about becoming desireless in a lifeless way. It is about seeing that desire was never the source of joy. It was the movement away from the present moment. As that movement slows, life begins to feel quieter, less dramatic, but also more honest. And the mind, not yet trusting this quiet, calls it loss, even though it is actually release. As desire fades, another layer of discomfort often appears, a sense of not knowing what to do with yourself. Without the familiar pull of wanting, the old map of life stops working. The routines that once felt purposeful now feel mechanical. The roles you played so confidently begin to feel thin, almost performative. According to Alan Watts, this confusion arises because most people never learned how to live without chasing something. We were taught to move forward, improve, accumulate, and compete, not to simply be present without a goal. Alan Watts frequently pointed out that Western culture treats desire as a moral duty. To want is seen as healthy, ambitious, and alive. To not want is seen as laziness, failure, or emotional collapse. So when awakening weakens desire, the mind immediately tries to diagnose the experience as something wrong. But this diagnosis comes from conditioning, not truth. The ego feels threatened because it no longer has a storyline to maintain its identity. This is why you may feel detached from your own life. You are still living it, but no longer psychologically invested in its outcomes. You may go to work, speak to people, fulfill responsibilities, yet inwardly, something has shifted. The urgency is gone. According to Alan Watts, this is not disengagement from life, but disengagement from illusion. The illusion was that fulfillment depended on outcomes. At this stage, many people feel guilt. They wonder if they are wasting their potential, letting life slip by, or becoming unproductive. But Alan Watts would say that this guilt is simply the echo of a value system that equated worth with striving. When that system dissolves, the nervous system doesn't immediately know how to rest. It keeps waiting for the next desire to arrive so life can start again. But awakening does not replace old desires with new ones right away. There is often a quiet in between, a space where the old motivations have died, and the new way of moving has not yet revealed itself. This space can feel empty, but it is also deeply honest. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being chased. Life is no longer being negotiated with promises of future happiness. Alan Watts described this stage as learning to float instead of swim. When you stop struggling to move forward, there's a moment of panic, and then a realization that the water has been holding you all along. Desire was the frantic swimming. Its ending reveals a different intelligence, one that does not operate through tension and grasping. This is why awakening often feels like losing direction. But what is actually being lost is false direction, movement driven by fear of not being enough. When that fear dissolves, action can still arise, but it comes from clarity rather than lack. And until that clarity fully settles, the mind remains uncomfortable with the silence where desire used to live. As this silence deepens, you may begin to notice something unsettling. Not only have your desires changed, but your relationship to pleasure itself has shifted. Things that once gave strong emotional highs now feel muted, while simple moments carry an unexpected depth. According to Alan Watts, this happens because awakening changes the way experience is processed. When the mind is no longer constantly projecting happiness into the future, it becomes more sensitive to the present, but less dependent on stimulation. Alan Watts often spoke about how desire creates intensity by contrast. Wanting something badly makes its temporary satisfaction feel dramatic. But when desire dissolves, that drama fades too. Life becomes quieter, subtler, and less theatrical. And for a mind accustomed to intensity, this calm can feel like dullness. The ego equates excitement with aliveness, so when excitement fades, it assumes life itself is fading. In reality, what is fading is the addiction to emotional peaks. This is why many awakened individuals feel disconnected from entertainment, excess consumption, or constant stimulation. The nervous system no longer seeks distraction as a way to escape discomfort. According to Alan Watts, the need for constant stimulation is actually a sign of inner resistance, a refusal to sit with the simplicity of being. When resistance relaxes, the urge to fill every moment disappears. At this stage, the mind may attempt to revive desire through nostalgia. It recalls times when life felt driven, passionate, intense. It asks, why don't I feel like that anymore? But Alan Watts would say that those highs were always paired with lows: anxiety, striving, fear of loss. The piece emerging now may feel less exciting, but it is also less fragile. You may also notice that social comparison loses its grip. The urge to compete, impress, or measure yourself against others weakens. Without desire feeding the ego, the game of status feels hollow. This can create distance between you and people who are still deeply invested in chasing goals and recognition. Conversations may feel repetitive. Ambitions may sound borrowed. According to Alan Watts, this is not superiority. It is simply difference in orientation. This shift can feel isolating because much of human bonding is built around shared wanting, shared goals, shared struggles, shared dreams. When you step out of that current, you may feel like you no longer belong anywhere. But this does not mean you have lost connection. It means connection is changing form. It is becoming less about agreement and more about presence. Alan Watts would say that the end of desire reveals a deeper pleasure, not the pleasure of getting something, but the pleasure of not needing to. This pleasure is quieter, less dramatic, but more stable. And while the ego may mourn the loss of intensity, something deeper recognizes the relief of no longer being pulled forward by endless wanting. At this stage, you may also notice a profound shift in your relationship to your own life story. Alan Watts often emphasized that much of human suffering is rooted in narrative. The constant, I must become this, achieve that, gain approval here story that the ego tells itself. Desire fuels the narrative, creating a sense of urgency, a direction, and a drama that structures our lives. But as desire ends, the story begins to unravel. The ambitions that once defined you feel arbitrary. The identities you cultivated start to appear like costumes. And the future, once a constant horizon of goals and fears, no longer has the same pull. This unraveling can feel deeply destabilizing at first. Without a story to hold on to, the mind experiences what Watts called existential vertigo. You may feel untethered, uncertain, even frightened. But paradoxically, it is in this destabilization that freedom begins to emerge. The ego's grip on meaning loosens, and life can be experienced with less resistance. You are no longer running after fulfillment because the need to run has softened. Alan Watts explained that this is not about becoming passive or disengaged. Rather, it is about engaging with life from a place of authenticity, curiosity, and presence. Actions arise naturally, but they are no longer driven by compulsion or desperation. You may still pursue projects, relationships, or creative endeavors, but the driving force behind them changes. It is no longer, I must have this to feel complete, but this arises, and I engage with it fully because it resonates with what is present. During this phase, clarity begins to emerge. You start to notice the difference between actions arising from ego-driven desire and those arising from awareness. Watts often compared this to distinguishing between a puppet moving on strings and a being dancing freely. Old desires were strings pulling you forward. The new impulses are spontaneous, arising from alignment with the flow of life. They are quieter, but they carry a deeper satisfaction. You may also experience a profound sense of relief. The constant striving, the endless wanting, the chasing of goals and validation, all of it fades. What once felt like pressure now feels like freedom. Alan Watts noted that when desire ends, we no longer carry the heavy weight of craving, the subtle tension of not enough. The body relaxes. The mind becomes spacious. There is room to breathe. Yet this stage can still feel disorienting. Without the usual motivations, life may seem slow, flat, or empty. This is the transition phase, the bridge between old patterns and a new way of being. Watts emphasized patience here. One cannot force desire to reappear, nor is it meant to. The mind must learn to rest, to inhabit the quiet, and to discover that existence itself is sufficient. As this stage deepens, something remarkable begins to unfold. A sense of presence replaces the urgency of desire. Alan Watts often said that most of life is spent chasing ghosts, pursuing things that promise satisfaction, recognition, or security, while missing the richness of the moment itself. When the compulsion to want dissolves, attention naturally turns inward and outward without the filter of craving. Ordinary experiences, the sound of wind, the warmth of sunlight, a quiet conversation, begin to carry a subtle, almost imperceptible joy. It is quieter than the highs of desire, but more enduring, more complete. This is where many people first glimpse the difference between pleasure and fulfillment. Desire always seeks pleasure in the future. Awakening brings fulfillment in the present. Watts explained that pleasure is transient and relies on contrast, hunger before eating, lack before acquisition, absence before gain. Fulfillment, by contrast, does not require contrast. It is inherent in being, in simply noticing and participating in existence. The mind, accustomed to chasing pleasure, initially misunderstands this subtle shift as emptiness. But it is anything but emptiness. It is freedom from dependence on the next high to feel alive. Another profound aspect of this stage is the reorientation of values. Without desire, you no longer need to prove anything to yourself or others. Social expectations, competitive pressures, and the relentless measurement of success lose their dominance. Alan Watts often described this as stepping out of the game, not abandoning life, but no longer being consumed by it. You act, create, and relate, but your actions arise from authenticity rather than obligation. You are no longer a player fighting for points in an invisible scoreboard. Relationships begin to shift naturally as well. Connections that were fueled by mutual ambition, approval, or shared striving may feel strained. Old friendships or romantic attachments may subtly loosen. But this is not loss in the true sense. Watts emphasized that such changes are alignment rather than rejection. When desire fades, people are naturally drawn to resonance rather than projection. The bonds that remain are quieter, truer, and more profoundly connected, not dependent on shared craving. This stage can feel lonely at first. Human beings are habituated to desire-driven energy, and the absence of it can seem like absence of life. Yet Watts assures us that this is not emptiness. It is space. Space for insight, for creativity, for presence. The world is not smaller. Your perception is simply less cluttered. You begin to see what was always there, without the distortion of constant wanting. Finally, a subtle sense of trust begins to emerge. Freed from the compulsions of the ego, you begin to sense that life itself is sufficient. You do not need to acquire, prove, or escape. The absence of desire is not death. It is liberation. Watts often reminded us, the self is like a wave in the ocean. Desire creates tension as the wave pushes against the water. Letting go allows the wave to flow naturally, in harmony with the current. In this surrender, there is a quiet power, a deep peace, and a sense of being fully at home in existence. As the dissolution of desire continues, another subtle but profound change takes place, a deepening awareness of impermanence and interconnectedness. Alan Watts often reminded us that clinging to desire is a form of resistance to life's natural flow. Every craving assumes a future that can satisfy the ego. Every attachment imagines permanence in what is inherently transient. When desire fades, the illusion of control begins to dissolve, and you start to see life as it truly is, fleeting, dynamic, and interconnected. This realization can initially feel unsettling, because the ego no longer has the familiar footholds it relied on. But it is precisely in this letting go that freedom emerges. You may notice that goals and achievements no longer feel like necessities. They may still inspire action, but without the weight of compulsion. Watts often compared this to the difference between swimming with tension and floating effortlessly in water. The current of life supports you. You are no longer struggling to propel yourself forward. Actions arise naturally, guided by insight rather than need. Decisions are made not from fear or craving, but from clarity and attunement to present moment. This is the subtle art of living without clinging. Another layer of awakening becomes apparent, the diminishing of self-centered identity. Alan Watts taught that much of desire is rooted in the ego's need to assert itself, to prove that it is significant. When desire ends, the ego's urgency softens. You no longer measure yourself by accumulation, by approval, or by comparison. The narrative of, I must become, I must achieve, quietly loosens. You discover that the self is not a static entity, but a pattern of experiences, ever-changing, ever-flowing. And in seeing this, the mind experiences a curious freedom, a spaciousness that was previously obscured by constant wanting. At this stage, the sense of peace may feel strange or even boring at first. Life no longer offers dramatic highs or clear milestones. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies a profound richness. Watts often described this as joy without cause. It is not dependent on success, recognition, or fulfillment of desires. Instead, it arises from the simple recognition of being, a subtle, enduring pleasure in existence itself. Ordinary moments gain a new vibrancy. A breeze on the skin, sunlight filtering through leaves, the sound of a familiar voice. These are no longer taken for granted. They are fully felt without the overlay of wanting. Many people at this stage also notice a shift in creativity and intuition. With the constant pressure of desire lifted, the mind is free to explore, imagine, and respond spontaneously. Watts frequently highlighted that true creativity does not arise from striving or grasping, but from presence. When the mind is not preoccupied with attaining, it can flow freely, and actions arise that are both effortless and profoundly aligned with life. Desire may return occasionally, but it no longer dictates direction. It is simply a visitor, not a master. Finally, a quiet gratitude begins to emerge. Not gratitude for things acquired, not gratitude for accomplishments or possessions, but gratitude for existence itself. Alan Watts often emphasized that life, unfiltered by craving, is inherently miraculous. The end of desire is not emptiness. It is awakening to the fullness of now. You may have thought you would feel loss or absence, yet what appears as liberation, the freedom to simply be, to flow with life, and to experience reality without the distortions of constant wanting. As this stage matures, the culmination of awakening becomes clear. Life no longer needs to be chased to be meaningful. Alan Watts often reminded us that much of human suffering comes from believing that fulfillment is somewhere else, in some future goal, person, or achievement. When desire ends, this belief quietly dissolves. You begin to notice that life has always been complete in its ordinary moments, that existence itself contains everything needed for satisfaction. The mind may still attempt to measure and compare, to seek novelty and stimulation. But these impulses no longer dominate your awareness. You are no longer a prisoner of craving. You are a participant in being. This is not a state of apathy or detachment. It is a profound engagement with life free from compulsion. According to Alan Watts, when desire no longer drives action, actions arise naturally from attunement with the present moment. You may create, work, and connect, but not because you need something in return. Instead, these activities flow from authenticity and alignment. Life becomes less about accumulation and more about resonance, a harmony with the current of being itself. One of the most striking effects of the end of desire is the subtle liberation from fear. Desire often carries with it the anxiety of lack, the worry that what is wanted may not be attained, or that life will be incomplete without it. As desires dissolve, this anxiety gradually disappears. Alan Watts pointed out that freedom is not the acquisition of more, but the release from needing anything. In this freedom, there is peace, clarity, and a profound sense of sufficiency. Life no longer feels urgent or desperate. It simply is, and you are fully present within it. Relationships, work, and personal goals may continue to appear, but they are now approached differently. No longer driven by egoic hunger, you interact from awareness rather than compulsion. Watts often emphasized that this creates a more natural, effortless presence. People are drawn to this authenticity, even if they cannot articulate why. It is the difference between acting from fear or need and acting from insight and being. You begin to discover that influence, connection, and contribution no longer require striving. They arise spontaneously when your attention is fully present. Finally, the end of desire is not a final destination but a doorway. Alan Watts likened it to standing in a vast empty room after leaving behind the clutter of old attachments. At first, the emptiness can feel threatening or dull, but over time, it becomes a space of infinite potential. You can move, create, and respond without being driven by lack. You experience life directly, rather than through the lens of wanting. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, simply because it is observed fully, without interference from craving. In essence, the ending of desire is liberation from a lifetime of being pulled by illusions. It is the quiet freedom of being at home in existence, of no longer needing to become, acquire, or escape. Alan Watts often reminded us that this is not something to force or achieve. It is something to recognize. The end of desire does not make life less alive. It reveals life in its most vivid, subtle, and eternal form. You are no longer a seeker. You are simply here, fully alive, fully present, and profoundly free.